Hello to everyone who is joining us. I'm just going to give things another minute or two as we wait for people to come in. But thank you, and we'll speak with you soon. Okay, we're at 2 minutes past the hour now, so we're going to go ahead and kick off as people carry on coming in with us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I know we've got people joining from around the world today. We're going to be hearing today from Clark Yakovakis, who is the Scholarly Services Librarian at Oklahoma State University. And he's going to be telling us some of the more fun and interesting things that you can do with the Elements API. If you do have any questions throughout, you can pop them under the Q&A functionality here in GoToWebinar. We'll come back to these at the end. We do also have Kate, who's our VP of Product, on the line, and she'll be able to answer maybe any of the broader Elements questions. If there are any left at the end, or there are questions that we need to refer to the wider team, then we will come back to you afterwards. We don't have time for it today. The other thing I need to mention is we do have a North American user meeting coming up in October in Pittsburgh. So I'm going to pop a link to that in the chat so that if you haven't registered for that, you can go ahead and take a look at that. We are still in the process of putting the agenda together. So if there's anything you're working on that you'd like to spotlight, please do get in touch with us. We'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I think that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to the very capable hands of Clark.
All right, thank you very much, Natalie. Are you all seeing my screen?
Yes, you're all good.
Okay, thanks. Hi, I'm Clark Yakovakis. As Natalie mentioned, I'm the Scholarly Services Librarian at Oklahoma State University. I just dropped into the chat the URL that you can use to download these slides if you'd like, as well as some of the scripts that I'm going to be going through. So a big thanks to the digital science team for putting this together, and I'm really excited to show you. So let me get this GoToWebinar docking station out of the way. And that URL is also going to be at the top of these slides if you need it. So this is the way that I expect this hour to go. I'm going to start off with a general introduction about me and about this project. I'm also then going to go through a few use cases where the first two will be interacting with the API, first using Postman, second using R. Then I'm going to demonstrate utilizing R to get access to the reporting databases and do some manipulation there, and then wrap that up with a view of building data extracts using Visual Studio. So what my plan is to kind of talk about each one of these, and then I'm going to jump out into them and do a little bit of a demo for each one. Then, if we have time, which I expect we will, I'll go through some more advanced use cases, talking about what a quick look at what a data migration would look like. We're in the process of doing a big migration right now. And then finally, a process we developed to do some text mining, creating text corpora and running Boolean queries on publications from our system. Then I hope we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So this is really a showcase. So I'm going to be showing you this. I'm going to be demonstrating it. I'm going to be talking about some of the things that we've learned along the way. Also, as mentioned, if you want to download the scripts, you can do so at the Figshare link. But what this presentation is not, I'm not going to be giving detailed configuration instructions. So I'm not going to be going into depth on what you need to do in order to get these systems up and running on your own computer. This is also not meant to be participatory, where you're walking along and we're all doing it together. I will talk about my steps, but I won't be going over every single step. And then finally, this is not intended to be a best practices. I would say it's a good practices, but there may be better ways of doing it. You can look at my experts profile. So we call our elements instance at Oklahoma State experts directory. So sometimes I use those terms interchangeably. That's at experts.okstate.edu. I have a MS in Information Studies from the University of Texas. I'm currently president of the Oklahoma chapter of the Association of College and Research Libraries. I'm also a member of the Expert Finder System Steering Committee. If you're not familiar with Expert Finder System, I really encourage you to look us up, join our email list, and get involved. It's a great community of people who do this kind of work. And also from some of the more kind of detailed implementation type of questions, I have presented many times on those, and you can see some of those in my experts profile. Right, so here at OSU, we began our implementation in 2019. It's led out of the library, but it's supported by a number of people across campus. We rolled out our Discovery public profiles in 2021, and we're currently sitting at about 119 public profiles, getting about 11,000 clicks or so per month. Just so we're all on the same page, when I say API, I'm referring to Application Programming Interface, and that's really just a way of getting one system to be able to talk to another, either to feed information into it or to pull information from it. And there's plenty about that on the Elements support site, including a full user guide. I'm not going to be doing much about pulling information from Elements using the API, but we do have an application running on our university directory where whenever anyone hits on a person's university directory profile, it sends a query out to our Elements API. And if that person has made their profile public, it will put a link into their public profile as well as pull in their photo. I didn't build that application, but someone in our IT office did. The reporting database, on the other hand, is all of the tables that comprise the system. And this is in a SQL Server reporting database. And there's really good articles, again, from Symplectic on using the API versus the reporting database, as well as a full reporting database guide. All right, let's jump into it. So first off, using Postman to write institutional appointments and user labels. If you're not familiar with Postman, it's an application for building and testing and sending API requests. It's a tiered model, which means that it's got a free version, and actually they're very generous with their free version. It does quite a bit, but it's also got some paid versions that do even more. If you go into the Symplectic support site, you can download a full Elements API collection, and I'll show you a little bit of that in just a moment. In Postman, what you do is you configure your environment so that with each API request, for example, if you are adding publications into the system, each API request, you'll send along the base URL. And we created separate environments for dev and for prod, just so we have to be very intentional on which system we're using, as well as the username and the password, which this you can set in the Elements web interface. And then any external variables you're going to pass into the request URLs. So for example, if you're modifying someone's profile, you would pass in a data source proprietary ID. And this gets pulled in. This is basically the column name from a CSV file, and that gets passed into each request. And we'll visualize this in just a moment. And then you can configure your authorization in Postman using basic auth so that with each request, it's passing in both the username and password. Institutional appointments, if you're not aware, there are two options if you're using the discovery module for representing a person's home department. One is to use their department and position as it comes in on the HR user feed, and the other is to use institutional appointments. On the left here in the bottom left corner, this is a screenshot of our HR user feed, and something you'll notice is that the titles are abbreviated, and this is due to character limitations in that database, and sometimes there are multiple positions in a single value. Some of these departments are abbreviated as well. So from the outset, we opted to use institutional appointments. And we did a survey. The university was going through an accreditation. And so the provost sent out a survey to collect both degrees. We built the survey internally because we knew what data we were going to need to collect both degrees and current appointments and the years that they started in those appointments as well. So we did a massive ingest from the outset in order to represent our institutional appointments. To make modifications to the institutional appointments, you need to send a patch call to the base URL, user records, manual, and then whatever the data source proprietary ID is for that individual user. This is what that would look like in Excel, for example, where you have the title, the department of the person, all of this other metadata, as well as their source ID. And then, so then with each request, what happens is you also send along a XML file, and that gets uploaded into the system and the data gets created in the database. And what you'll notice here is that for each XML node, it maps out to whatever the column on the spreadsheet is. So university gets populated into organization, department gets populated into sub-organization, and so on. So this is what that looks like. I'm now in Postman. I have set my authorization already. That's in my global environment. So my credentials should be sent with each request. While I'm at it, let me show you over here on the left side. This is the Elements API collection that is created by Symplectic that you can download from their support site. And they've got a lot of great examples. Most of what we've done is built off of these as a baseline. And this is my big, huge collection of API requests that we've created over time. So we have API requests for our equipment module, for some of the migrations we've been doing, and so on. But for today, I want to show you the institutional appointments collection. It's important to, if you're going to be automating this by using, for example, a CSV file, that you create a new folder for each request. Because when you do the collection running, it's going to run, if you have multiple different requests within a folder, it will try and run all of those. But this is the way that the request looks. We have the body, which is what I just showed you on the slide. We have our authorization, which is being inherited from the parent. And we have our URL here, patch request, and the URL I sent earlier. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this. And let me show you what I'm going to be doing for myself. I have two appointments here, assistant professor and scholarly services librarian. So if I wanted to add in a third, I'm going to go ahead and click run. Then I'm going to select my file. And you can see a preview of that here. So it's got my name, it's got the title that I want to add, and it's got my proprietary ID. So then I run that, I have a success, and I jump over into my dev and I refresh the page, and I now have a new appointment there. So it's fairly straightforward. Most of the hard work in a lot of this is in getting the data clean. And then once you've done that, it's really sort of just a matter of experimentation to set the requests. Real quick, because I don't want to go into too much detail, using institutional appointments, they do have to remain locked. So it does require monitoring and updating. And once per year, we need to run in promotions. So we've got a whole process developed for that, where we add in the new appointment and we move the previous appointment from institutional to academic. And you have to think about what order it's going to appear there. But once you have this scripted out and in place, it's relatively painless. So, it took a long time to set it up, but this last year, after the regents approved the promotions, it really just took a couple of hours to send. And that also means that automating name changes for the department is fairly easy. And we can talk a little bit more about institutional appointments if you have questions at the end. Before moving on from Postman, I also want to talk a little bit about user labels. So as you may know, there are 3 label schemes that come stock for each individual. Those are availability, fields of research, and sustainable development goals. We actually created custom label schemas for availability and fields of research that allow us to make modifications, like removing some of the Australia-specific fields of research, changing some of the British English to American English. And we added a few different availability label schemes, label options as well, like inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility support, and art, design, and music commissions, and so on. So, excuse me. So to add a label to a user, you need to send a patch call, again, to users/user ID. And this is the way that the XML would look. You really only need 2 values, and that is the user ID and the name of the label that you want to add. So you see here that I'm specifying the label scheme within the XML, and then it passes this SDG label description directly into the XML. So what that would look like here, I'll show you. So you can see that right now I only have 1 sustainable development goal. If I want to add another one, again, here is the body of the request. I'm running a collection. I select the file that I want to add. It's test SDGs. You can take a look at the preview where we've just got user ID and label description. And run that, we've got a pass, and we come here, refresh the page, and I now have another. So we'll come back to this when I talk about a process we did to pull SDGs from publications and add them to users. So I'm going to leave Postman behind for now and move on to using R. There are many different ways that you can interact with APIs other than Postman, and R is one of these. You'll see the scripts if you download from the Figshare, the way that the username and password must be encoded. There's a short string there that will encode it properly to make sure that every time you send an API request, the authorization header is sent as well. Postman does a lot of this in the background so that you don't have to do it yourself as you do in R. So let's take a look at what this would look like if we wanted to add photos. Again, most of the hard work is going to be in connecting a photo to an individual. One way of solving that issue would be to rename the photo with the element's user ID and then loop through that directory. And that's precisely what I'm going to show you here. So within R, you set paths to your photo directory. Of course, you have to set the base URL. And then this is what the script looks like, where you're looping. The map function is sort of like a for loop. So you're looping through that photo directory. You're extracting, this is some what's called regular expressions. So you're extracting the first word from the file name, which is the user ID. You're constructing the URL. So it's got the base URL / users / whatever ID field was just pulled in that iteration of the loop / photo. And then you're doing a put request where the URL is what you just constructed. The authorization is passed from what you did earlier. And then you're uploading that image file. So I can show you what that would look like as well. You see that I don't have a photo here. I'm going to go ahead and open R. I've already set my configuration credentials separately, as well as my base URL and my directory. So all of that is set in my environment already. And this is my loop here. And I'm just going to run that. Do this. I have to put a period in front of my authorization because I hid it so that you all couldn't see it. So we had a success, presumably, and this script will fetch the results of those requests. And then if I come here, sometimes I gotta wait a minute and click out. So we'll give it a minute. But you can imagine how much time that could save if you have a big directory of users, so long as you're able to, I'll come back to this later and we'll see if it's in there then. So long as you're able to rename those files according to the element's user ID. I don't really use much. I used to use R to interface with the API a lot more, but now I really do most of my work in Postman. This is an exception because it's uploading a file, which I don't know if Postman can loop and upload files in a loop. All right, so moving on to using R to access the reporting database. This is something that I do all the time. It's immensely powerful, and it is really super helpful way of getting access, easy access to the tables and making manipulations. So you can connect directly to the reporting database using functions from the ODBC and DBI packages. And this is what the connection string looks like, where you're specifying it's a database connect. The driver, the server database and user ID is passed from the R environment. And we set it up so that it prompts you, if you're using RStudio, it prompts you to input the password. That way we're not actually storing a password in any of our scripts. And we don't have to worry in case those scripts get into someone else's hands that they're going to have that that password embedded into the script file. Now here's what we're going to do. Our goal is to create a single file that has publications metadata, like title, abstract, and journal name. And we want to filter that so the privacy for those items is all set to public. We want user information like name, if they're current, if they're academic. We want their appointment data, which is another separate table as we just discussed. And then we want the relationship between the user and the publication, because we only want publications that are claimed. And we also want only publications where the relationship is set to public. And you can, again, download this code from the Figshare repository. So I'm going to run through the code and then I'll show you a little bit of it in R itself. In order to connect to a table, well, let me jump over into R and show you here under connections. I know it's probably small, but you can see right now I'm connected to the reporting database. And if I look under prod reporting and DBO, you can see all of the underlying tables. So really it's a matter of connecting to these and pulling them into your R session. And that, the way that I do that is I call a table, TBL, and I pass the connection that I just created and the name of the table. I then coerce. So if you've never used R, this is what's called a pipe, and it takes the output from this line and uses it as the input for the next line. So I pull down the table, I coerce it into something called a tibble, which is just a data frame, a grid of rows and columns. I then almost always run the clean names function, because what that does is it makes it all lowercase, and all punctuation, including spaces, is converted into an underscore. So it just makes it a lot easier, as you can see here, when I'm dealing with these columns, it just makes them a lot easier to type out. Another thing to consider is that for each one of these tables, the unique key is named just ID. So if you are joining together lots of different tables, that can get very confusing. So good practice for me is to rename that ID to represent whatever table ID it is. Following that, I'm going to pull down the user table, select the values that I want, do my renaming, and here's where I filter out so that I'm keeping only people who have set their profile to public, and then finally connect to the appointments table. One thing to note is that the publication record table contains all records for every publication object. So this would have, if one publication had records for Scopus, Dimensions, Crossref, Web of Science, whatever, all of those would be in that table. Whereas publication contains only the record for the item with the highest source precedence, as you set that in elements. I think I got that right. Correct me if that was wrong during the Q&A. It also contains all publications in the system, so you really need to, including pending and rejected. So you really need to join that with the publication user relationship table, which we'll do next. And let me jump back into R and show you, I've already pulled down the publication table and the publication record table, and you can see the difference in numbers to almost 255,000 records versus 85,000 publications. Continuing on, so we've got a user table and an appointments table. We join those together, and here we use user record ID. If you're keeping track, this is the third individual user ID that we've run into. So you do have to kind of keep track of which user ID does what. We're filtering to keep only institutional appointments, and only, in fact, the first institutional appointment, which we are assuming is their current appointment. And then keeping only current staff and academic staff, and doing a few more things here. Then we are pulling down the publication user relationship table, and finally doing an inner join for the user and appointment to that table. So keep in mind that the publication user relationship table only has IDs. It doesn't have any publications metadata. So it says this user 2029, is connected to publication 563. Right, so the final join is to then connect that back to the publications table and decide which variables you want to keep: title, abstract, publication date, and so on. So all of that sounds like a lot, but once you've got it scripted out, come over here into R. So as I mentioned, I've already got my publication tables pulled down. So really all I need to do is highlight that script and run it. And I now have, in that quick, less than 2 seconds, I have all of the publications that are claimed by current academic staff, including their appointments, and they're only public. Remember, there's 3 levels of privacy. There's user privacy, there's object privacy, and there's relationship privacy. So all of that is accounted for in the script. Then if I wanted to, for example, just examine one single publication, I could look at that. If this is a publication that myself and Megan Mackin co-authored, if I only wanted to put in a user ID, I could look at just that user's publication, or I could filter by department and so on. So it can be very handy if you're finding yourself having to do routine reporting. So we're doing really well on time. That's good. And I'm sure you'll have questions, and hopefully you are adding those to the Q&A, and we'll come around to them at the end. So As I mentioned earlier, we did a project to pull down, so let me back up a little bit. Publications automatically come into elements with fields of research. Those are associated with the journal that the public, if that journal has a field of research associated with it, that publication will be linked to that field of research, and that is represented as a label. If you have dimensions as a data source, publications also come in with sustainable development goals. So what we wanted to do was take those labels associated with a user's publications and link those to a user. We didn't have very high uptake on people manually adding fields of research or sustainable development goals, although it's getting better. So this was a way of kind of establishing a baseline. And we did have to weigh, the risk of manually adding this content versus, and possibly getting it wrong. So I'll show you one way that we kind of got around that, or at least attempted to mitigate it. So the publication label data table is completely separate. And what that has is the publication ID and any labels that are associated with the publication. In this case, we're filtering it to include only those items where scheme ID is 21. That scheme is sustainable development goals only, not, so that will get rid of fields of research or any other labels associated with that publication. And then we do a second filter here to only include the publications that we created in the last step. We do a join then, join the publications metadata to its labels. And that way we have the publication metadata and the label all in one, as well as the user. Then what you can do is you can group it by user ID and SDG description. So you can see that user 5 has 5 publications that are associated with zero hunger, 4 publications associated with reduced inequalities, and so on. And we found that those SDGs that are added in dimensions are highly accurate. And here's one data point that speaks to that. What we did was we filtered out any items where there was only one publication associated with that SDG. So we just got rid of those altogether. Then, so the file then should look familiar to what we saw earlier, just a user ID and a label description, and that can just be run through. You don't really have to worry about deduplicating it. It's not a big deal. It could maybe affect the order, depending on if you want them in a specific order. So we did this last February, and we checked it a couple months ago to see if anyone had removed any of the labels that we had added on their behalf. And out of hundreds of labels that we had added for people, only 3 people had removed that label. And I'm not sure exactly why, but we took that to be a pretty good indicator that it was getting it right. Either that or people didn't notice or they didn't care, which I think happens as well. But then what the benefit of associating a user with a SDG is that you can then, I'm going to jump out into our discovery instance, which is experts.okstate.edu. You can then facet, and again, we did the same thing with fields of research as well. That's why so many of these top level fields are so general, because again, the field is associated with publication, not the specific article. But that way you can facet on field of research as well as sustainable development goals. That's the benefit of having that link between a user and a label. So we're at 34 after. Let's keep on moving along. I tried to pack in as much information as I could into this, so apologies if it's information overload. And what we're going to do next is look at building data extracts in SQL with Visual Studio. So if you did not know, Elements allows you to upload an SQL file that can then be made available to people with statistician access to run reports on their own, so they don't have to go to you every time they need data. And the way that I have found it most simple and straightforward, again, I'm not a computer programmer myself, so a lot of this stuff I just kind of had to learn along the way. So for me, the most straightforward way is to use Visual Studio. Again, they have a Visual Studio community is free, just like Postman and R. So all of these tools are available for free, which is a huge benefit. If you're going to go this route, I also recommend downloading the SQL Server data tools and Microsoft Reporting Services projects extensions to Visual Studio. So what you can do then is build a connection to your data source, and I'll jump into Visual Studio in just a second. Actually, I'll just do it now, might as well. So I have a new solution here. I have a shared data source where we'll take a look at the properties for that. It's a SQL Server data source, which you specify the type there, and you build the connection string with the data source, what's called the initial catalog, which is the database that you're connecting to. And then with the newer versions of Visual Studio, you need to set the trust server certificate to true because the default is false. And so it will refuse to connect unless you set that. And you can pass the credentials in here or in the connection string. But once you've got that set up, you can then create a shared data set. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new data set, and I'll show you why I like using Visual Studio for this. I'm going to use the query designer here, and I'm going to make this bigger. So what you can do here is you can pull in tables. So I'm going to pull in 3 different tables. I'm going to get publication. I'm going to pull in user. And then under views is where you have the publication user relationship right here. Okay, and it will try and join them for you, but I'm just going to delete those joins and show you myself. So watch this SQL script down here as I do the following. I'm going to take the ID from the publication table, and I'm going to drag it into publication ID on the publication user relationship table. Then I'm going to take the ID from the user table, and I'm going to drag that into user ID on the same table. And you can see that that SQL is getting built out dynamically. You can then decide which columns you want to keep just by checking the box, and it will add it. So see what I mean? It's very visual. And so for someone like me who doesn't do a lot of writing in SQL, it saves a lot of time, and it also helps me kind of visualize how these different tables are related to each other. So then you can go ahead and just run the query right away. You can also type in SQL, so I can say where user.id equals 2029. Hopefully I did that right. Okay, and it sends the query. And then if I wanted to add in more values from the publication table, I could do that as well. But I'm 2029, that's why I don't hesitate to show you this kind of stuff. This is not private. And this is also, I think, connected to our dev instance. So most of the stuff I haven't even written. But then once you have written out your SQL, you can then just save that as a .sql file. And you can then upload that into Elements, where you would go to, let's see if my picture came. It didn't come. So maybe there was an error for that. I'd have to troubleshoot it, but it worked yesterday. So we'll go into reporting, data extracts, add in a new data extract, and then you just upload the CSV file. And here's something else is that you can specify different parameters, like do you want it to be available just for groups or just for users or just for groups and users, and add in if you want to filter by current or filter by academic. And what you may want to do is just look up some of the stock reports that the team at Digital Science have already built, and you can export those definition files, and you can just build off of the SQL that they've already made. But I wanted to show you an example of one of the things that we did, which was early on in the pandemic. There were people who were interested in who at the university had been publishing on COVID. So we developed a report that would look through the abstract, the keywords, and the title for words associated with coronavirus. So we have COVID. This is in regular expressions again. And then, so we constructed that SQL query and we uploaded it to the database. Well, I almost always set also privacy parameters as well to make it at least only where internal and public items are available, just so, to respect if people have marked something as private, prefer not to return it in any reports, period, even if the person has statistician access. So yeah, I think that's it for Visual Studio. That's really all I wanted to show you, I believe. Yeah, and this is what it would look like on the user end as they're running that report. All right, let's move into our couple of advanced use cases, and then we'll open it up to questions. As I mentioned, we're right in the midst of a data migration, so I thought it would be useful for some people to hear how that works. And this is it. Again, all of the tough work comes up front in creating the file. So we have this database, and we have our database, and we have to map this one to that one. Is a description over here the same as an abstract over here? Are there differences within types? For example, is a title in a journal article the same as a title in a book review? Or which is the title field in a book review? Is it the title of the review, or is it the title of the book that's being reviewed? This is why I'm a strong advocate of getting libraries involved in these processes, because this is the kind of stuff that we think about all the time. So once you've got a file and you've got, so let's say, a row for each that publication that you want to add, and you also have it linked and associated with a user in Elements with that user ID, you then construct a put request with the unique ID. You want to get a unique identifier for each item that you're adding that's separate from the identifiers that are used in Elements. Of course, they don't quite exist in Elements yet. So, but then you send the request to publication, records, manual. Again, you're just building a manual record. And the unique ID will go on to become the data source proprietary ID for that object, and appending the update reporting dates as well. And this is what the XML looks like, the body of the XML. So you can see that URL up at the top. And if you're using different types, so for example, if you are writing in journal articles, books, book chapters, and so on, you can specify the type in the import record node. For those values that have no nulls, so we knew in this data set that title, every single row had a title, you can just write that directly in the body. But I wanted to show you this really incredible and useful bit of script that Owen helped us with Digital Science, helped us develop when there are null fields in a column. What you can do in Postman is you can write a little bit of JavaScript that will run prior to each request. So, what this pre-request test script does is it first unsets it from the previous iteration. Then if there is no data in that cell, in that value, then nothing is sent to, nothing is uploaded. It's just a blank. Otherwise, if there is data there, then it constructs the XML And that is what then gets put in place in the XML body. That might be a little bit too advanced for some of you, but if you're working on data migrations, this was an absolute lifesaver, and I'm happy to talk more about it. Then what's important to keep in mind is that you cannot link simultaneously create a new object in Elements and link it to a person, because Elements requires the object ID in order to link an object to an individual, and the object ID doesn't yet exist. So you add the metadata, then you can use the reporting database to pull down those values, and you just filter it using the unique keys that you from your initial data set. And presuming you have an Elements user ID, you then send a post request to /relationships. And here you only need two values. You need the object ID that you would have just gotten from the reporting database, and you need the user ID that presumably was in your data set to begin with, and that will establish the connection. So like I said, that was a snapshot, and then I have 4 more minutes to run through something pretty exciting that we developed doing some text mining. So as a librarian, I often want to perform complex Boolean queries on the data to get more precise and accurate results. So here we use R, specifically the corpus tools package in R, to transform the abstract, keyword, and title fields for each publication record. And I use the publication record table for this because some data sources may have more complete metadata than others. For example, oftentimes Crossref does not have an abstract, whereas that abstract will be in Scopus or Dimensions. So I query each record for hit, and then I just deduplicate based on the object ID, the publication ID. And this is what that would look like in R, where we're pulling down the publication record. We're preparing the corpus with abstract title and keywords. And then we are writing our Boolean queries. So let's say we wanted all articles that had something to do with unmanned systems. Those could also be called robotic or robots. That's what the truncation here does. So what this is saying is every result that comes back has to have at least one of these terms, and it also has to have at least one of these terms within 2 words: autonomous, intelligent, self-governing, and so on. Or if I want only articles dealing with radiation, mitigation, and space, I have 3 combinations here: radiation, protection, safety, mitigation, exposure, and astronauts, space crew, and so on and so forth. So the rest of this is just scripting that out, where I'm calling search contexts, and that will execute the query, then doing some subsetting to get rid of any queries that had 0 results, and basically just writing the results so that I can deliver a CSV file for each set of results that had a hit. For each queries, all of the hits within each query. So summing up, these processes definitely can take a lot of time to learn. It's been really fun and interesting to learn all of this stuff. I feel like, as I mentioned earlier, I have a humanities background, and I have not gotten any formal training in data science, so I don't think that there's anything special about me. I think that this is something that we can all do. It just can take a lot of time. So you have to balance the amount of time that you can and are willing to invest in learning all of this with the advantages of adopting it, and see how that all balances out. So with that, I will open it up to questions.
Hey, Clark. Thank you for that. That was great. We've got a couple of questions coming in. For those that haven't sent those in and have them, this is your time to pop them into the Q&A section. So we have, how responsive were the faculty when asking for their degree data, sort of percentage response rate?
It was because it came out from the provost with some urgency, and multiple times we had a pretty high response rate. I think it's been several years now, so I don't know the exact percentage. I mean, I wouldn't say it was over. I would say it was somewhere between half and three quarters, possibly less. Maybe I'm being a little bit generous. And that did present a dilemma for those people who hadn't offered that, because then we didn't have their degree data. So in that case, there's nothing that we could do. And we also didn't have their current appointments. And the tricky thing about current appointments is the date of starting that appointment is different from the date that they began at the university, which is typically the date that gets pulled into the HR feed. So we did have to work with our HR and institutional research office to kind of figure that out, and we did the best that we could. We got in as possible, and then from there, as soon as people make their profiles public, I'm able to see if they don't have any appointments added. So typically what I'll do is just add those manually through the user interface, which means that I have to unlock that field because it has to stay locked, because if someone puts a variation in the department name, like maybe uses a lowercase letter instead of an uppercase, when that gets pushed into discovery, that would create a new department. So that always has to remain locked. But I would say it's really not a big deal at all. And it's at this point, not time intensive.
And we have another very current question. Have you tried using ChatGPT to write any of these queries?
I just tried ChatGPT to map. So I had a bunch of activities in my database that I'm migrating from that were just marked other. And we do have an other, but I wanted to try and parse those out more specifically to say, like, okay, this is a peer review, this is a committee membership, this is an award. So I did say, here's the types that I have, here's the data. I want you to give me a table, assign each one of these rows to one of the types that I've specified. It did okay. It was inventing types that I hadn't specified. And I think at the end of the day, it would be easier to do that myself, to say, if you detect the word award in this field, then just make it an award type, and really script that out myself. I think at this point it was an okay start, but I determined that it would take more work. But I have used ChatGPT to write R scripts, and it does usually give you a pretty decent baseline that you can then especially if it's something that's totally unfamiliar to you, that you can then kind of tinker with and make it work for you.
And we also had a question asking if we could share the link to the official API documentation and sample Postman scripts, which we have done. Those are in the chat if anyone wants to access them through there. Oh, here's another one. Are you experiencing an increase in report requests as you have made this information available? If yes, how do you manage these requests? Do you offer training to others across campus?
That's a great question. We have experienced an uptick. Some people who are maybe writing a grant or have been awarded a grant, who are looking for people whose areas of focus, looking for very specific areas of focus, accreditation kinds of things, which are usually fairly straightforward to deliver, like degree data, for example. But we haven't experienced it as much as I anticipated. As far as access to the reporting database, we really haven't given that out to anyone. We try and just maintain that centrally and create the data extracts or the reports ourselves and make those available in the Elements interface. So I keep waiting for the unmanageable influx. And I do think that it will come as we're still sort of new in our implementation. I mean, we're about 3 years along. So it's manageable at this point, but we're very aware, we're a very small team here. So we are aware that we need to, it would be great to have another person who could just completely dedicate themselves to this, just because I do think that demand is going to come more and more.
We have a thank you, everyone involved, for a great session, and I'll echo that. Great to hear from you as ever. I can't see any more coming in. I'm trying to see, but the sun is quite in my eyes at the moment.
Just one little reminder from me.
Very impressive, interesting to see your progress. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I think we were out of phase. Just one little reminder for me, which is please remember that you all have a non-production as well as production instance of elements. And if you're planning on doing some experimenting, we strongly encourage it, but we strongly encourage doing it in your test environment to avoid any surprise rollbacks. But yeah, thanks for the fantastic presentation, Clark. Really great.
You're welcome. Yeah, I would second that too. We did have
Thanks.
one.
And if there's any
Sorry, we did have one kind of catastrophic data loss where we used clear when we should have been using remove, and so it cleared. And we were doing that. We did it in dev, and we didn't check adequately. We ran it in prod. We hadn't backed up, so the data was gone, and we did have to do a recovery. So, yeah, have your processes well in place before making data modifications.
Great stuff. And this session has been recorded, so that will be circulated soon to anyone who was registered or anyone who wants to come back and rewatch. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us afterwards and we'll do our best to respond to them. Thank you again, Clark, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.